Triassic. All right, so got the, hang on. Don't want male. Get rid of male. Hang on here. I'll zoom. Okay. There we go. So now we're going to start what we're going to spend several weeks on, which is going to be exploring dinosaur diversity. And in each case, we'll go down towards the base of the family tree and then work our way up the various branches to see the changes of diversity, the new adaptations that arise, the ecology. In some cases where it's important, the geography. Some of these groups are going to be limited into where they exist, and that's going to be important about their ecology. That is interaction with other organisms. And plus, I suspect for many people, it's one of the main things you wanted to do with this class, is learn about the types of dinosaurs. The other main thing was probably to learn about their biology, which we'll discuss some in this middle section and then continue with in the third section. So, the focus of today's lecture is going to be on the armored dinosaurs, the Thyreophora. But we have to get to them first. So, last time we saw the basic Dinosauria. We saw that there are three major groups, Ornithischia, Sauropoda, Morpha, and Theropoda, and that the interrelationships of those three groups are a little unstable compared to the status they were 5 years ago. But that for this course, we're going primarily with the idea that sauropodomorphs and theropods are closer to each other than either are to ornithischians, the traditional Saurischian hypothesis, with the caveat that future data may show that that is actually incorrect. So we're going to start with the base of Ornithischia, and so this and the next two lectures will be in different groups of Ornithischia. But we have to start at the base. Now, you don't have to memorize these detailed cladograms, but I provide them as a way of learning about the subject and getting a feel for what's going on. So here we have the base of Ornithischia with this creature, Pisanosaurus, which may or may not be an ornithischian. As I mentioned in a lecture last time, it's traditionally thought to be the oldest and most primitive ornithischian, but some people think it's a non-dinosaur, that's a silosaurid, and still others think that silosaurids are actually basal ornithischians. And if that's true, then we actually have ornithischians filling up a lot of this space, down all the way into the beginning of the Middle Triassic. But the hypothesis we're going with here is that Pisanosaurus is probably an ornithischian, but that silosaurids are not. And you can see a bit of a puzzle that is without other than Pisanosaurus, we don't have any definite evidence of ornithischians in the Triassic, although they should be there. Now, this is not the biggest gap in the history of dinosaurs, so it shouldn't trouble you too much. But it is a bit troubling. So we see on here that there are various branches at the base. We'll get to the Heterodontosaurids in a bit, and then this cluster of sort of unresolved relationships, the sort of generically primitive ones. And then two big clades. The clade we're going to cover today in detail, which are the Thyreophorans, the armored dinosaurs. And then next week, we'll go from the base of Ornithischia and then up into ornithopods for your duckbill fans. Those are those guys and their kin. And then we'll wrap up the ornithischians by going up this branch, which are the marginocephalians, the domeheads, and the horned dinosaurs. So here's a look overall at ornithischian traits. Again, you don't need to memorize the details. When there's an important trait, I'll typically have a slide or two with them. But this puts them into context, and that you see that these groups are evolving through time, that subgroups are characterized by transformations, and so forth. So, Ornithischia, the name, as I mentioned last time, means, I think I mentioned last time, but I didn't, bird-hipped. It's the same ornith as in ornithology, the study of birds. Technically, you might think that it should be ornithopubes, because it's the pubis that points backwards, which is a bird-like trait. There's nothing in the ischium that is particularly bird-like, but, take it up with Seeley. He's been dead for a long time, but he's the one who gave these names. And these are indeed called ornithischians because in all, except possibly Pisanosaurus, the pubis points backwards. And that's a trait that they have in common with birds. Although, as we will see, birds are actually not bird-hipped dinosaurs, because birds evolve it independently. And a definition for Ornithischia is Iguanodon, and all taxa sharing a more recent common ancestor. There's a concestor with Iguanodon, not shared with Megalosaurus or Diplodocus. This is Iguanodon in the background. And here is a typical Ornithischian pelvis. This is the primitive armored dinosaur, Scelidosaurus. And just to orient you, this is a left lateral view. So this is the ilium. This is the acetabulum. The bones are somewhat separated from each other at the moment. Here's the pubis. Here's the ischium. The ischium always points backwards in pretty much everything. But the pubis, remember, normally points forwards in most animals, but it has moved backwards. That's the shaft of the pubis. However, a trait that characterizes Ornithischia that seems to have appeared even before the backwards pointing pubis is the predentary bone. So what's that? We see here in little Lesothosaurus, in lateral view, and this is in ventral view. This is the underside of the chin. So we're looking at it. There's the premaxilla, and there's the maxilla, and there's the dentary. And what the hell is that? There's a bone in front of the dentary. But there's not supposed to be a bone in front of the dentary. And in the vast majority of animals, there is not a bone in front of the dentary. We'll do one thing even more weird. Unlike most skull bones, which have a left and a right, this is a single bone. A single bone that attaches to both the left and right dentary. And so when it was discovered by Marsh, there was not really a name for it yet, so he gave the non-creative name, but it got the point across, predentary bone. Indeed, Marsh preferred the name predentata for the group we call Ornithischia, and it's kind of a shame that didn't stick. It's available out there if you want to use it as a subgroup within Ornithischians. So this is a beak bone. So it is a toothless bone, and the texture of the predentary suggests that there's technically what we call a rhamphotheca, but that's just a beak, a sheet of keratin coming off of it to form a little cropping beak. Now, not a huge one. You can see the scale of it. It's not a huge beak, but a little cropping beak at the bottom. Also, the two dentaries fit into the predentary bone, and what has been appreciated more recently, like in the last 5 to 10 years, is that the dentaries pivot relative to the predentary. And that allowed them, the Ornithischians, to do something that many herbivorous sauropsids can't do, and that's chew. So by chew, we don't mean just chomp. We mean processing the food while it's still in the mouth. So my lizards do not chew, even though they eat plants. They just chomp, gulp, chomp, gulp. A turtle, chomp, gulp. But these guys could process the food somewhat in their lower jaw, or in their jaws. Close the jaw, and as it's closing, the dentaries pivot outward somewhat, and that allows the teeth to grind the vegetation and chop it up more finely before they swallow it. We will see other groups of Ornithischians get far more complex versions of this. Yes?
So, in this skull diagram,
right.
Well as a question for other basal Ornithischians, do they have this kind of bone in the upper jaw as well?
No, they do not. We will see a group on Wednesday that gets a bone in the upper jaw that is the mirror image, but only that one group has it. Yeah, go for it.
I just wanted to clarify, was the predatory bone part of the chewing process, or is it just because of the formation of the lower dentary like?
Oh, right. The predentary would basically stay in place, and the others would pivot along it. It gives them a surface against which they can pivot. And so these guys could process vegetation up in their jaws more finely than a lizard or a snake, or a typical, say, herbivorous pseudoseuchian, herbivorous primitive synapsid, and so forth. Now, one thing that dinosaurs... Okay, I normally don't do this, but I'm going to need to do this for this example. I'll do this again. I know, I've got a face. We as mammals chew by moving our lower jaw back and forth as a whole unit. Dinosaurs couldn't do that. The way the connections for the lower jaw worked, they would have to go up and down. In some cases, they go back and forward, but they can't go back and forth like that. So that's something that the folks in Jurassic Park get wrong. They show this cow-like action in the jaws of a plant-eating dinosaur. They can't do that. That's a mammalian trait. So instead, they found other solutions The function of having our lower jaw going back and forth is to grind our upper teeth versus the lower teeth. This is just another solution. So the upper teeth are in place, the lower teeth move relative to them, and they can wear them down. Okay, so that's the predentary bone. Characteristic of all ornithischians. God, do I need to recharge this? Okay. Also, ornithischian teeth have what we call phyllodont dentition. That simply means leaf tooth. So it's sort of a leaf-shaped tooth. And in modern reptiles, I think I've already shown you this slide before. Actually, not this part. Here's some examples of some phyllodont teeth for real in position, rather than just isolated as an ankylosaur tooth. Here are some other ornithischians. These leaf-shaped teeth in the modern world are associated with lizards that feed on vegetation, at least partly. And indeed, in the fossil record, we find many animals with phyllodont teeth that we associate, which we assume were herbivores, was mostly herbivores. Now, although the incomplete pelvis of Pisanosaurus looks like it may have a forward-pointing pubis, it's not at all certain because the shaft isn't preserved. All other ornithischians have a condition we call opisthopubi, which just means a backwards-pointing pubis. So let's take a look at the little EO cursor here. There's the ilium, there's the ischium. The pubis always attaches anteriorly to the ischium. But whereas the shaft would normally point downwards like this, the shaft is rotated backwards. Why? Well, the guts, or as the vast majority of the intestines, are always going to be anterior to the pubes. They form sort of a cup that holds them. By shifting the pubis backwards, that increases the volume that you have to digest plants. That is, increases the volume for the guts. Now, a basic aspect of digestion is it takes a lot longer to digest plants than it does to digest meat. Meat is much easier, much faster to digest. You don't need as long. And duration is expressed by the length of your intestines, because that's where you're doing all this digestion as it's going along. A herbivore has to have a bigger gut. They just do. In fact, if you ever look at a horse or a cow straight on, they tend to be really round. But if for some reason you're able to look at a wolf or a lion straight on, like at a zoo, not in real life, not in the wild, hopefully, you'll notice they're much narrower unless they're being overfed. And that's so they can get away with that. Well, by increasing this gut volume backwards, that means these animals didn't have to be super round. I mean, they're rounder than carnivorous dinosaurs, but they don't have to be super round, because they've actually just moved those guts further back. It also sort of keeps the center of mass pretty well placed. And so at least early on, you could be a fairly quick-moving animal, like a little EO cursor, about 1.5 meters long, about 4 feet, 5 feet long. You could be a fast-moving animal, but still digest a lot of plants. And here's another one, another early Jurassic form, Lesothosaurus, and there's, ilium, ischium, pubis. Opisthopubi, backwards pubis. Now, many of the ornithischians also have another trait where the tendons above the vertebrae, so axial, above the vertebrae, well, they're around the vertebrae, but they're on the upper surface, are ossified. That is, a tendon that's become bone. And you can see this sort of network or grill here. Just to orient you, that's the back of the skull. This is the small horned dinosaur Protoceratops. This is the dorsal region. This is the sacral region. That's the right ilium and the left ilium. And you see this grill work of ossified tendons. And one interpretation of this is that they could act as an energy store. A lot of features in organisms that can be bent somewhat act as energy stores, like springs. So they're stretched a little, so they're strained, they get energy. They can release that energy, and then that's an energy saving on the animal. And this would actually allow energy saving while they're moving along, because they can be flexing up and down in this direction. It's an energy spring, it's an energy store. Now, what has been a contentious debate is whether ornithischians had cheeks or not. So, we know that they do not have cheeks homologous to mammals. Our cheeks are derived from muscles that in sauropsids are in the throat. It's a long story. But people have noticed for some time that, first of all, most ornithischians have a tooth row that's inset. That means it's medial to the jaws. They're not along the edge, the outside edge of the jaws. They're in somewhat. Many of them also have a ridge, at least on the dentary or the maxilla or both. And so some people suggested maybe there was, if nothing else, a piece of skin over there that might function in some ways like a cheek. And the argument being this: if these guys are going through all these adaptations to process a lot of plant material, it would be good to keep them in the mouth. You know, my lizards, turtles, and so forth can get away with having about half the food fall out of their mouth when they're eating it, because they got low metabolic rates. But as we'll see, there's a lot of evidence that dinosaurs had high metabolic rates, and you don't want to be wasting food. However, if they had cheeks of a conventional sort, we're not certain where they come from. Now, it's not inconceivable that they had skin cheeks. Some birds have skin cheeks right behind their beaks. And here's a condor. Most lizards don't. I mean, maybe a little hint of one, but they don't have much. And it's worth noting that there are herbivorous lizards today that do have inset tooth rows. So this is a slice. Now we're looking at it 90 degrees from that. You see the teeth are not on the edge. They're inset. They even have a ridge above and below, and yet this animal has no cheeks. So people have been debating this for a while. Alternatively, maybe there was a bunch of keratin back there. You know, some sort of beak-like structure back there. Now, a recent set of work by my colleague Ali Navamazeda has considered the possibility that they may have cheeks as the result of as a secondary result of jaw muscles, rather than a new set of muscles. He's been looking at the potential jaw muscle attachment positions in different groups of ornithischian dinosaurs, and indeed in non-ornithischian dinosaurs, and finds that instead of being restricted towards the back here, there's evidence that they continue quite far forward. Now, these are still jaw muscles associated with the upwards and downwards motion of the jaw, and also the forward-backwards in some groups. But a consequence of this position is that they wind up creating a barrier for food in the jaws. And presumably would, of course, that skin covering over them, and therefore you get a skin cheek. And so not the idea of a new set of muscles, but a set that already existed, but to accommodate that, some sort of limitation of food coming out of the jaws. And so different sorts of ornithischians would presumably, based on their jaws, have different sizes and amounts of cheek. All right. So we have this critter, Pisanosaurus, that's definitely Triassic, but as I talked about before, may actually be a silosaurid. And notice how incomplete the pelvis is. There is evidence, though, that it has a forward-pointing pubis. So that's interesting. We get some forms from the earliest Jurassic, though, that show us that ornithischians are indeed present by there, and we infer that they would, if they are indeed the sister group to any other dinosaur group, they have to be present in the late Triassic. So here's an interpretation of Pisanosaurus as a silosaurid. All right, the first group that's relatively important, it's not that big, of ornithischians are the Heterodontosaurids. Heterodontosaurids show up in the earliest Jurassic. They actually survive into the early part of the early Cretaceous. So that's actually pretty long duration. They are overall, as a group, rather than any one individual genus, but as a group, the smallest ornithischians known. So they range from about 0.8 meters, so 80 centimeters, that's not quite 3 feet, to 1.5 meters, so about 4 feet long. And you can see, like most of these, in most dinosaurs, half the length is tail. So we're talking about smallish animals. One thing Heterodontosaurids retain that most later groups of ornithischians are going to lose is they've got that big classic basal dinosaur hand with the the semi-opposable thumb, the grasping fingers, and the highly reduced digits 4 and 5. We'll see more derived groups of ornithischians are going to shrink up that hand. But these guys still have a grasping hand. So here you see one. It's not quite fully grown, but showing, 70 centimeters long, 28 inches. Little guys. Heterodontosaurus, and here's the Heterodontosauridae. It's named after this guy, Heterodontosaurus. Heterodontosaurus, the name means different toothed lizard. And it's because it has sort of incisor-like premaxillary teeth. And actually, they've got a big canine in the front of the dentary and the back of the premaxilla. And then typically chopping teeth behind that. So they've had differentiation of the teeth, like we saw happen in therapsid evolution. Also, they have pretty solid skulls, and most of the evidence suggests these guys are eating pretty durable vegetation. They were never super common, but they did have sort of a long range. And here's a reconstruction of one. We indeed know that these guys were fuzzy, because we have specimens of at least one from Chanyu Long here from China, where we could see, fuzz preserved coming off of the body. This was the first ornithischian for which we had good evidence that the body was fuzzy. And so here is we don't know the colors for this creature, so this is an imaginative thing, but a nice little fuzzy early ornithischian. And their lifestyle, they seem to have been small. They definitely were small. They seem to have been relatively fast and agile. Some people have suggested that they could climb trees. They don't necessarily have particular adaptations associated with it, but on the other hand, goats climb trees, and they have even fewer adaptations for climbing, so these guys are in the right size range for that. So those were Heterodontosaurids. We're now going to move over to the main focus of today, which is the Thyreophorans, the armored dinosaurs. So here is the cladogram for armored dinosaurs. And just to show briefly, we have primitive branches, we have the stegosaurs, and we have various types of ankylosaurs. So, the name Thyreophora. Thyreos is, technically it means door, but in this context, it's for a long shield. In classical times, in ancient Greece, a Thyreophora would not have been a dinosaur, it would have been a position in a military unit. The Thyreophoran was the shield bearer at the front of a military unit who had the really tall rectangular shields, those curled rectangular shields. And the idea is they were protecting the other ones who would be stabbing over with spears and pikes. So in the late 19th, early 20th century, around then, a paleontologist thought the shield bearer would be a good name for a group of armored dinosaurs. And the two major divisions, as you see here, the stegosaurs and the ankylosaurs. Oh, before I forget, just an aside to put next to your notes for Heterodontosaurids, the traditional interpretation, the current normal interpretation, is that they are the basal most important branch of Ornithischia. There will be a radical interpretation we'll talk about on Wednesday. But just throwing that out there. I just wanted a little note. Spoilers. So what makes a Thyreophoran a Thyreophoran? Well, they actually have some other traits, and they're mentioned on the lecture notes. But the thing that we'll pay attention to is osteoderms. Osteoderms are armor in the skin, literally bone-in skin, osteoderms. So they're small bits of bone that themselves in life would have been covered by keratin, by horn. And many of them start off as little flat surfaces with a crest along the top. We see similar sort of armor plates on the backs of, say, crocodiles, but some of them were more spike-like. Now this is armor in the oldest and most primitive Thyreophoran, Scutellosaurus. Just to point out, this is actually from a paper by a former student in this class who is getting his PhD now and has been studying Scutellosaurus. Had a couple papers come out on Scutellosaurus recently. So here we see a more derived form, a stegosaur, And they're still dinosaurs without their armor, but on top of the rest of their skeleton, they've got osteoderms of various sorts. The main function, of course, of osteoderms is some form of armor. And in a world where you've got predatory dinosaurs around, armor is a really useful thing. But there are all sorts of functions for armor, including competition within the species. We'll talk about that towards the end of the lecture, but we've seen a preview of that at the top. And who knows how other dinosaurs may have used that armor. So. Now, osteoderms are not unique to Thyreophorans. As I mentioned, other archosaurs have that, so modern crocodiles do, and some of their extinct relatives. And in fact, these forms over here, these quadrupedal armored pseudoseuchians, were sort of the first draft of Thyreophora, or rather Thyreophora, if we go for the right order in time, were the second version of this. This is the archosaur's first version to do a bunch of quadrupedal armored herbivores. Thyreophorans were much better at it, though. Well, it lasted long. So Scutellosaurus here, the most primitive, it's a biped. This is shown bigger than life size. This is a 1.5 meter or so long animal. But with all that armor on its body, probably not particularly fast. Here's a very recent reconstruction of it, a couple of them hanging out with a therapsid. And that armor might have been useful against small-bodied carnivores, but as you can see here, was probably not particularly useful against the large-bodied dinosaurs that were evolving at that time. And so, evolution sort of allows a couple options for that. You can maybe become faster and more agile, which would have been useful, but there were already other dinosaurs doing that. So they were already good at that, and if you're not so good at it, you're probably not going to win out in competition, and those variants that are becoming a little more agile are probably going to lose out. But what if you become bigger and throw more armor on your body? And that's the approach that was successful in Thyreophoran history. Bigger body size, a lot more body armor. And a good example of that is Scelidosaurus here, shown life size as projected. So you can see me against this, that shows you the size of this animal. Sacrificing speed for heavier armor, but a consequence of that, having this big, heavy body, means you're not going to be a biped anymore. Maybe you can raise up on your hind legs to feed on occasion or to intimidate something, but you're not going to be walking around on your hind legs. You're going to be a quadruped. And so this is our first example of dinosaurs going from obligate bipedality, that is walking around on two legs as the ordinary form of locomotion, to obligate quadrupedality, back on all fours. And the hand becomes a foot again, basically. Now, from something like Scelidosaurus, we get the two different major branches of Thyreophora, each of which emphasizes a different strategy, at least when we reduce it down to sort of a first-order approximation. It's not to say that the other group doesn't use some of this strategy. In Stegosauria, more of an emphasis on active defense. So instead of using your armor to pretty much just absorb the damage, you keep a body that's fairly mobile in order to fight off attackers. Alternatively, in ankylosaurs, you just keep on throwing those points on more and more in defensive armor and soaking up the damage. Now, that's a stereotype, and we will definitely see ankylosaurs with some armor that's used actively. But on a sort of a first-order approximation, those are some of the major selective aspects of their history. So, Stegosauria, commonly called the plated dinosaurs. The name Stegosauria, which is derived from Stegosaurus, the original, first really recognized one, that means roofed, or to a certain amount shingled reptiles. And that comes from the fact they didn't know how the plates were arranged when they first discovered it. They thought that the big flat plates that we now know stick vertically on these forms, they thought they were overlapping plates down the back of the animal. So sort of like the shingles of a roof. This, what I'm showing here, is one of the most primitive stegosaurs from the Middle Jurassic. Stegosaurs first appear in the Middle Jurassic. The capital J is for Jurassic. They're pretty common in the Middle and Late Jurassic. And they're present, but increasingly rare, in the early part of the early Cretaceous. The capital K is a shorthand for Cretaceous. And the stegosaurs don't even make it to the midpoint of the Cretaceous. So there's no stegosaurs around at the end of the age of dinosaurs. So what makes a stegosaur a stegosaur? Well, first let's take a look at the differences of their armor style. They typically have some combination of plates and spikes. So a plate is mediolaterally compressed, but can be dorsoventrally and anteroposteriorly tall. So it's like squished this way, and maybe extended up and forward and backwards. So a flatter structure overall. These are all derived ultimately from the little back osteoderms with that crest on it. So basically what happens with a plate is you take that crest and you stretch it out and forward. In Huyangosaurus here, it's relatively small plates. In Stegosaurus, they're huge, and in other forms, they're intermediate. But stegosaurs can also have spikes. Spikes are conical. And different genera of stegosaurians, or stegosaurs, have different combinations of sizes and amounts of plates and spikes. Just like if you could recognize different antelope species and genera from each other by the shape of their horns, and different deer by the shape of their antlers, you can recognize different stegosaurs by the combination of plates and spikes. Now, stegosaurs have a specialized set of spikes at the end of the tail. It's two pairs of spikes that seem to be laterally oriented. Good specimens, like the specimen shown here, shows that they were laterally oriented, not vertically oriented, as people thought for about a century. Now, there was no formal name for these technically speaking, there is still no formal name for them. But the fact that we have a pair of laterally oriented spikes suggests something that might be useful as a name. Now, in the cartoon, the newspaper cartoon, The Far Side, back in 1982, there was a Far Side cartoon where we had a caveman giving a military debriefing or something and saying, now this end is called the Thagomizer, named after the late Thag Simmons. And that was kind of funny. But people who work on Jurassic dinosaurs kind of picked up on this and secretly started labeling displays at Dinosaur National Monument Thagomizer. And additionally, 10 years after this, in 1992, at the meeting of the Society of Vertebrate Paleontology, my colleague Ken Carpenter was describing this specimen. And in his talk, when he's going from this wonderful specimen, almost complete, he's going from head to tail. When he got to the tail, and now on to the Thagomizer. And so many paleontologists have picked up on this as the sort of the informal, formal name for this thing. There's no committee that says that's the formal name of them. But those of us who aren't sticks in the mud like to use Thagomizer as the name for this laterally oriented set of weapons at the tail of a stegosaur. And here we see stegosaurs as Thagomizer from the business end. An advantage of having this pair of laterally oriented spikes, or two pairs of laterally oriented spikes at your back, means you can defend yourself when you're getting away from your opponent, which is probably a good idea. But of course, if you get cornered, or if your opponent is more agile than you, which it probably is, having the ability to sweep and clear out an area could be pretty useful. So stegosaurs seem to have been fairly agile, not really fast, but fairly agile, compared especially to ankylosaurs. So sort of the ability to pivot around and whack that tail out. We have evidence of the Thagomizer spikes contacting the bones of contemporary carnivores. So this is a caudal vertebra, a tail vertebra of Allosaurus, one of the primary predators of the late Jurassic of Western North America, with a damaged neural spine, a damaged transverse process that shows where a Thagomizer spike entered and pulled out. And there's even one where it's got a wound right up in its pubis. So the stegosaur thagomized its crotch. Now, it lived because that bone has a healing evidence, like an abscess that was draining stuff, but it probably wasn't happy about it. Now, stegosaurs have other types of armor too, beyond the plates and the spikes and the modified spikes of the thagomizer. Most of the early stegosaurs have some form of shoulder defense, big shoulder spikes that defend the flanks. Additionally, stegosaurs have flexible neck armor, really small osteoderms on the underside of the neck. We've known about these since the 1800s, but few display models, few display skeletons show that because it's been hard for people to mount them in place on a standing skeleton, but some of the newer skeletal models have shown that. And this is effectively sort of like medieval chainmail. It's not linked together as chains, like actual chainmail, but it's simultaneously flexible and defensive, and it protected the neck. All right, so the stegosaurian lifestyle. Stegosaurs tend to have very narrow snouts. And a narrow snout in modern herbivores tends to suggest a choosy browser. So something that's eating leaves and other plant parts, and is being selective about the plant parts it wants. Also, the biomechanics show that the bite is, as dinosaurs go, very weak. It's stronger than some of the other herbivores, but it's definitely vastly weaker than some of the groups we're going to see next week. Given especially the later forms, which have very short front legs compared to hind legs and a pivot point right around the hips, it's been suggested that some of these could have reared up on their hind legs, not to walk, but to feed. And this would give them a bigger feeding envelope. Now, stegosaurs were very common in some of the Middle and Late Jurassic formations. But they're common as individuals. We don't have good evidence that many of them lived together and died together. So not good evidence that they were herd species. And I'm just going to wrap up the stegosaurs by giving you a sense of some of their varieties. So here's Miragia from the late Jurassic of Portugal. There's Kentrosaurus from Africa, late Jurassic. Tuajengosaurus from China, a little older than those two. Hesperosaurus, a precursor to Stegosaurus. Some people even consider it a species within Stegosaurus. And in the specialized forms like Hesperosaurus and Stegosaurus, the neural arch looks like nature grabbed it and sort of stretched it out. And Stegosaurus proper, still the best known one, the largest one, or at least one of the largest ones. Now, those big plates, what are they for? Well, ancestrally they were defensive, but why make them so tall and spread out? Almost certainly there's some form of signaling device. When you increase the area on something, you almost certainly are making a big display. It's going to visually change your body profile. But a display for what? Different patterns on different species suggests that maybe they are for species identification. And display also has other functions. How nature says, do not touch. And animals and their mating songs. So for defense and for courtship. Now, we don't know how colorful they were, but they're covered by keratin, and keratin isn't always dull-colored. Think of the beaks of a bird, the different colors they can have. Think of the shells of a tortoise, or the box turtle, or other turtle species. They can actually be quite brilliant. We don't yet have evidence of what colors they were, but they could have been very colorful. Now, it's worth noting that the osteoderms of modern archosaurs also have a thermoregulation function. They help dump heat or collect heat, depending upon the time of day. And stegosaur armor could have done the same. Now, the other major group of Thyreophora are these guys, the ankylosaurs, the fused reptiles. Like their cousins, they first show up in the Middle Jurassic. They're relatively rare until the early Cretaceous. So they're around in the Middle Jurassic, they're around in the Late Jurassic. In the early Cretaceous, they begin to diversify. From the mid-early Cretaceous onwards, they become really common, and this group survives until the very end of the Cretaceous. So what I'm showing you here is a late Jurassic one, Gargoylosaurus. So, ankylosaurs. The name fused specifically actually refers to the fact that in some cases, the ribs are fused to the posterior dorsal vertebrae. I mean, these guys are actually all effectively one bone now. So that was the thing that was noticed in Ankylosaurus itself for the fusion. But that name has another significance because many ankylosaurs have osteoderms that fuse onto their brain, onto their skull. So this is a group that is definitely characterized by a lot of heavy armor. Different groups and different genera within groups have slightly different patterns, but there are some commonalities among them. For one thing, ankylosaurs are characterized by these rings of osteoderms on their necks and shoulders. So it's not an individual strip all the way across, but rather a set of osteoderms often fused together in rings, or ankylosaur workers sometimes refer to them as half rings because they're only on the dorsal surface, they don't go all the way around the body. But there's separation between them, so they're still a little flexible there. But there are extensive osteoderms over the whole body, so the body is really heavily covered. And in between the bigger scutes, the bigger osteoderms, are little ossicles, tiny osteoderms. They're not always preserved, but when they are, it shows just how heavily armored these guys were. So the little pebbly things, those aren't pebbles, those are armor. And then the bigger structures are the classic osteoderms. Now, some ankylosaurs have lateral or dorsal osteoderms that become really large, flat blades. And these almost certainly were at least partially defensive. A predator is getting too close, you move your body back and forth, and it keeps them at bay. Although they could have been used within species to fight each other off, locked together and pushed back and forth. Some have big pelvic shields where the little ossicles are all fused together into like almost a turtle-like plate. There's a pelvic shield from above. Even more, as I mentioned, the osteoderms are fused to the skull. In fact, it would be an evil and cruel thing for me to do, is to give you I'm not going to do this, give you an ankylosaur skull line drawing or photograph and ask you to identify the cranial bones. Because you wouldn't be able to, because you're not seeing them. These osteoderms don't map one for one with the bones underneath. So you can't see the maxilla, and you can't see the frontal, and you can't see the nasals, because the osteoderms are fused on there. Think of a football player whose football helmet actually grew into their skull. And in some cases, there's even armored cheeks. So a plate that comes up, attached to the lower jaw, that protects the cheek area, and even armored eyelids. So imagine that when you closed your eyelid, it had an armor plate on it and would protect your eyeball. Yeah?
So I'm going to assume that it's actually an exaggeration when you would hear occasional things like, oh, ankylosaurs are bulletproof bodies.
It depends on the caliber. I suspect that a typical revolver would probably be incapable of penetrating the armor of an ankylosaur. However, a much higher caliber one probably could get through it.
Right.
So, ankylosaurs typically have broader snouts than stegosaurs. And this suggests they were less picky about their diet. So they're cropping a bunch of vegetation all at once. But as we'll see, at least some probably have very powerful, flexible tongues. I'll show you how we can possibly know that. And that might be something like a giraffe uses as a way to get out there and grab the vegetation and pull it in. And unlike the stegosaurs, we have evidence that at least babies that some ankylosaur genera live together as groups. However, we still don't have things that look like ankylosaur herds preserved together. Now, a little bit about ankylosaur diversity. Oh, well, okay, not there yet. Ankylosaurs have very relatively small teeth for their body size, and the predatory has actually become this sort of U-shaped structure, and there's good evidence that the pivoting and the back and forth motion is even better in these guys than in some of the groups we've seen so far. So a lot more action going on in the lower jaw to help chop up vegetation for these guys. Now, these are the bones associated with the tongue. We actually have some of these bones as well, but in us they're like thin strips. In the case of ankylosaurs, uniquely among dinosaurs, they're huge and flat and plate-like. And we see that in animals today like anteaters or in lizards with powerful tongues and so forth. And it suggests that these guys too had a really strong tongue they could protrude out and pull food back with. Okay, now about the diversity. Just a week or so ago, this guy got named, but that's all we know of it. It's part of a rib with osteoderms actually fused to the rib, which is actually not something any other ankylosaur does. But it has texture of its bone that, so far, we have only seen in ankylosaurs. However, I don't have an actual money bet, but I would not be surprised if this turns out to be a really weird-ass crocodilian relative. Because there's a bunch of weird-ass crocodilian relatives that live around this time, and, could have been. Other Middle Jurassic ankylosaurs not known from very complete material, so it's not certain what they look like or where they fit in the family tree. Oh, here's a reconstruction of Spicomelus, this new one. But again, only one part of one rib is known. So this is basically taking a generic primitive ankylosaur and Scelidosaurus and sticking them together. But we see other ones early on that show the more generically ankylosaur traits. Just to show examples of them, some of them quite large. Here's one with the big side plates. Within Ankylosauria, there's at least one definite monophyletic group called Ankylosauridae. There's a question as to whether the other ankylosaurs form a single group or a paraphyletic series relative to the ankylosaurids. These are a Cretaceous group known mostly from Asia and North America, but we also have them from Australia and from Europe, because Hylaeosaurus, that third member of the original dinosaur trinity, Iguanodon, Hylaeosaurus, Megalosaurus, is a primitive ankylosaurid. And some of the traits that make these guys distinct, highly complex nose chambers, and a stiffened posterior part to the tail. And we'll see those coming up in a moment in detail. So highly complex nasal chambers. This is a non-ankylosaurid ankylosaur. And it's already pretty complex. The stuff in yellow is the nasal chamber that you can see as you CT scan the skull. And then you get to ankylosaurids, and it's like silly strings, or silly straws. We will see, in the third section of the course, everyone at my point, you should all say that together, that this is likely associated with aspects of their physiology. And when you've got a really heavily armored skull, it becomes even harder to dump heat. And so having ways to do that, when your skull is all surrounded by bone, can help. Ankylosaurs actually also seem to have forelimbs better for digging. Now, some people say, are these guys digging into nests of insects and scooping them up with their tongue? That's tempting to think about, but it's hard to justify, animals that can be multiple tons having a primarily insectivorous diet. That seems not to have been a way of doing it. So maybe it's to lay eggs. Some people suggest that they might have used them as defensively, dig holes and then get down in there as defense. Maybe. Within Ankylosauridae is Ankylosaurinae. This is the last group we'll look at today. And I'm just going to quickly wrap them up. Ankylosaurines, known only from the latest early Cretaceous of Asia and the late Cretaceous of Asia and Western North America. That is a pattern we're going to see in other groups. The main thing that characterized these guys, club tails. So they have osteoderms fused to the stiffened tail. And this is definite active defense. They also typically have little triangular horns on the skull. So here we see different forms and different patterns of skull armor in different genera, and probably different species within each genus. And just to wrap this up, the club tails, so primitive ankylosaurs, flexible tails, ankylosauridae, stiffened tail, ankylosauridae, club tail. And here's examples of tail clubs, heavy osteoderms fused to the stiffened rod. Quite large. Here's my friend and colleague Victoria Arbor, queen of the ankylosaurs, next to the tail of a creature she helped co-name, Zool. What's it for? It's for smacking. Evidence of forces of 10 kilonewtons or more. And you can see that's compared to punching or whacking with a baseball bat. Why? Well, these guys live in the same world as tyrannosaurids. Whacking their shins and metatarsi and skulls is probably a nicely defensive thing. But it's worth noting that most animals that have weapons use them primarily against other members of their own species, and there even is some evidence in armor suggesting that happens. So, that's it for the Thyreophora. When we come back, we'll explore the Ornithipoda, the beaked dinosaurs.